Two conflicts in the news yet again today, Russia-Ukraine and Israel-Gaza, where the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, has authorised renewed action in the Gaza Strip. And at the same time as that is happening, European leaders have come together and they are talking about how to defend their continent and the wider world at a time when President Trump's United States appears to be stepping back from its decades-old security commitments. So what we've done is we've brought together two of our top people, Katya Adler and Jeremy Bowen, to talk about both the Middle East and Ukraine on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in the studio and Jeremy is with us. Hi, Jeremy.
Yeah, hello. I'm connected up with you from South London and nice to be here.
Thank you very much. And Katya is on the line as well. Hello, Katya.
Hello, I'm talking to you from Brussels, which is exceptionally sunny today.
Oh, same in London. Very, very sunny. Now, we're going to come on to talk to you in a minute, Katya, about various things, not least about the aeroplane you've been up in. But first, we're going to talk to Jeremy about the latest in Gaza. Israel says it's resumed its ground operations, Jeremy, after this wave of airstrikes that, according to the Hamas-run health ministry, more than 400 people were killed in. What's going on?
Well, let me start with the caveat that because Israel does not allow us into Gaza to report, we have to do everything at arm's length, and we work very hard to talk to trusted people. But it's clearly not the same as being there yourself and talking. So that's frustrating and disappointing always. And I think it has to be said that the reason Israel doesn't let us in is because there's stuff going on there that they might have been responsible for that they don't want us to see. Because at the beginning of the war, when there were really horrible things going on in those Israeli border communities, then we were allowed into those. Why? Because they wanted us to see them. Anyway, having got that out of the way, I mean, what's happened basically is that with the backing of the Trump administration, the Israelis have given up on efforts to try to change the original ceasefire deal, the terms of it that was negotiated by the Qataris, the Egyptians, by the Biden administration to in its final days, and with Israelis, of course, and with Hamas involved. They've changed. They tried to change the terms of that. If you have a good memory for these things, you might recall that it was a phased agreement. The first phase has run out. The second phase was meant to be a continuation of the process of hostage release, but at the same time, the Israelis would have to pull out of Gaza. Now, the Israelis, backed by the Americans, wanted to change the deal, so more hostages were released, but with no pullout from Gaza, and certainly not with the assurances of the end of the war, which is what Hamas want. Hamas have been massively attacked now for a long time, basically lost all their top leadership, and at the moment, Israel's killing essentially the middle management of the organization. And the only, from their point of view, the reason why they took the hostages is they're the only asset that they have in terms of bargaining, so they were not going to give them up easily. And the Israelis have said, right, enough's enough. We're going back to war. The Americans have backed them. But there's also, as ever in Israel, there is a domestic political angle on all of this, which once again is about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu keeping his very hard right extremist coalition, the most extremist in the history of the Israeli state. He wants to keep it together, and to do that, he essentially has to go back to war, because to get all the votes he needs to get the budget passed, and if he doesn't get the budget passed, there will be automatically an election by the end of this month. He has to get that vote done. And the key people in this to get the numbers on his side up, Itamar Ben-Gvir and his party, who is a very extreme individual indeed. He is now back in the government, having resigned from it because of the signing of the initial ceasefire. And now that Israel started the war again, and there ain't going to be second phase. He's back in. Sorry, that was all a bit long,
No,
but
no,
it's a bit complicated.
There's a lot happening. It's always complicated. I mean, your entire life's work covering these events has been complicated, hasn't it? But because newscasters might think, okay, apart from the obvious of Benjamin Netanyahu needing these other elements of his coalition to keep him in power, do I need to worry about domestic Israeli politics? And are you saying there are interesting things that we should know? What else should we know about what's happening domestically? Because these are interesting characters, and they their inclusion in the government might mean something much more significant for the wider world, I suppose.
Well, these, starting with the real extremists in the government, these are people who not only do they say there should be no Palestinian state, they'd rather it if there weren't any Palestinians. They believe in what is euphemistically known in the lexicon of these things as transfer. In other words, the removal of Palestinians from the land they have called their home for many generations and many centuries. They argue they should go to some other Arab country. And what they would like to do, certainly when it comes to Gaza, and this is one of the reasons why Ben-Gvir resigned when the initial ceasefire, which included a clause in the future for an Israeli withdrawal, one of the reasons that he pulled out was that he absolutely believes in the return of Jewish settlers to Gaza. And what chimes in with this in their minds, which got them really excited, was that Trump plan for the so-called Riviera. You remember there was a just bizarre and somewhat fairly hideous AI animation showing what Gaza could be if it became the Trump Riviera, the Riviera of the Middle East, as he called it. It even included a portrayal of topless Donald Trump and topless Benjamin Netanyahu on adjoining deck chairs, sipping cocktails in the luxurious Dubai-style environment that would be created there. So those people who were always seen, actually, for many years as being on the mad fringe of Israeli politics are actually pretty much center right now in terms of their power and in terms of the fact that they believe that they can see that there is a president in the White House who thinks actually getting the Palestinians out of there, and he uses different reasoning. He says you can't run a big construction company with people living on the land. He says they should go somewhere else. So, of course, that excited them no end. And the White House has not pulled back from that position. Trump has not pulled back from that position. He still believes that a future would be to invest in the place if only the tiresome presence of those Palestinians was removed.
And then on the other side, you've got Hamas, who, to use those exact words, would like the tiresome presence, in their opinion, of the Jewish people to be removed and the Jewish state to be removed, and have taken hostages to try to further that cause.
Yep, they have been at war with Israel for many years. They carried out the 7th of October attacks, 1,200 people, mostly civilians, mostly Jewish civilians, Israelis, killed, some in the most hideous circumstances, hundreds taken hostage. And they've been living, Gaza, Israel, the Middle East, the wider world has been living with a fallout of that ever since. It's important to stress that the war between Israel and Hamas did not start on the 7th of October. This is a very long, intractable conflict. And by long, I mean more than a century. The Zionist Jews and Palestinian Arabs started fighting and killing each other more than a century ago over competition for control of the land. And as more Zionist Jews came in from Europe, that intensified. And essentially the unsolved problem at the nub of it, which is that there's one piece of land and two separate peoples want it and call it home, that's at the nub of the conflict. That took root more than a century ago, and it's still there. If you read accounts of Jerusalem in the 1920s, when the British actually were in charge, then when they talk about violence between Jews and Arabs, having spent many years there and seen a great deal of violence there, it is so familiar. It's extraordinary how the patterns haven't really changed.
Well, we're going to come on to Ukraine, where there's, goodness knows, a lot of violence as well in a minute. But before that, Jeremy, can I ask you just two related questions, which are, is Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu pulling the levers here? And within that, what is Benjamin Netanyahu's aim?
I get the impression that at the moment, the number one foreign policy agenda item for Trump is Ukraine and Russia. I think that's taking his attention. He is not renowned as a details man. He's not renowned as well as a man who has a very long attention span and he moves on. But that seems to be his focus. I think a month or two ago, you might have said actually it was Israel and the Palestinians and Gaza and his hopes for a wider grand bargain peace in the Middle East, also involving a rapprochement between Israel and the Saudis. That was all the talk back in January. That is so much on the back burner now. The Saudis have said that repeatedly that there has to be a Palestinian state before they'll consider recognizing Israel and normalizing relations with it. And at the moment, that could not be far further away. So I think that Netanyahu probably is pushing, but he's pushing at an open door because, first of all, Trump's political base in the United States is massively pro-Israel, massively supportive of what they're doing. And so from his point of view, he doesn't lose anything politically, not that he needs to run for election again, but he is someone, though, who likes to keep his supporters happy. So that's all right. So at the moment, he's allowing this to go on, I think. And I think he also seems to believe, and Netanyahu he's become a bit of a Trump mini-me in the way he's behaving. For example, he's just fired, or trying to fire, I should say, the head of the Shin Bet, which is the Israeli internal security, a bit like the MI5 in the UK. And he's fallen out with him, and he wants to get rid of him. And part of that is because the Shin Bet are investigating what happened on October the 7th, and Netanyahu, most Israelis believe, carries quite a bit of blame for what led up to that, and he does not want that investigated. So there's all that internal stuff going on. And, last point on this, that is very important to make, I think. It has not been this bad between Israelis and Palestinians since the foundation of the Jewish state in 1948, and the Palestinians, so what they call the catastrophe, the Nakba, when more than 700,000 Palestinians had to leave their homes, some by force and some because they fled. And it is as bad as it's been since then. And what is more, there is absolutely no sign of it getting better, and many signs of it getting worse.
And that is not just of concern in the region, not just of concern to Donald Trump, Katya, but of concern in European capitals as well, in European capitals, which are also very worried about what's happening in Ukraine. And you've been over, well, I was going to say you've been in one European capital, but I think that's not true. I think you've been over Estonia rather than in the capital, Tallinn. Is that right?
Well, I've been all over Estonia, and then I was up in the air over Estonia. That was in a NATO surveillance plane.
So you've been everywhere. In fact, you have been. Sorry, you have been in Tallinn, haven't you?
I've been in Tallinn. I've been in the north, in a town called Narva, which is fascinating. It's the border with Russia for Estonia. It's a tiny country, but the border with Russia stretches all the way from south to the very snowy north, where I was in Narva. And there, what separates the two countries is a river of the same name, so that the River Narva. And over the water, there is a bridge, which is one of the last open pedestrian crossings between a European country and Russia. And so there were these queues and queues of people standing in the snow and the wind, clutching plastic bags and small suitcases, because that part of Estonia is 96% Russian speaking, where Russian is the first language, and a lot of people there sort of have dual citizenship, and they go backwards and forwards over the border. But we spoke to the border guards who said there are constant provocations from Russia across the border. And I mean, Estonia's feeling very exposed. So if you have a look, it jumped at the chance when it could to join the EU and NATO simultaneously. That was back in 2004. And if you think about these policing flights over the Baltic states, so Estonia and its neighbours that NATO organises to sort of monitor any suspicious activity from Russia next door, that NATO membership and those flights, that the one that we were on, really made Estonians, made people in the other Baltic countries feel safe, but they don't feel so safe anymore because of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I was really struck by the line you wrote in a piece you've written for the BBC website, saying the Baltics are nervously biting their nails.
They are nervously. Yes, that's fair to say. I'm not sure they would like that analogy, but you do get that sense of angst. But again, when you talk to politicians, I was talking to the Estonian defence minister, they are hoping beyond hope that the US isn't going to turn away. But I think that's common across Europe. Even Emmanuel Macron of France, who for a long time, in good French tradition, has talked about strategic autonomy from the United States, so this idea that you've got to be more independent of the United States. But nobody wants to let go of the United States. And that's not just because of a fondness for the transatlantic relationship. It's because Europe has relied on the US for 80 years, ever since the end of the Second World War. Europe, after the end of the Cold War, failed to invest in defence. Most countries no longer have conscription. So Europe is lacking on so many levels. It's not just those countries close to Russia that feel exposed, although they feel it most. But if you talk to military minds across Europe, they say, even if we raise lots of money, and I'm sitting across from a building where EU leaders have been gathering today to talk about more aid for Ukraine, but how to really, really boost defence spending in Europe as well. It's not just a question of money, it's a question of capabilities that we've relied on the US for so long that it will take years to become sort of more independent when it comes to aerial surveillance, for example, logistics, command and control. There's a lot of catching up for Europe to do. So I think it's a mistake sometimes to listen to Europeans across the board, EU and non-EU, saying we're going to boost our defence spending, to think this is a letting go of the United States. It's a kind of let's catch up and be able to look more about ourselves in the hope of impressing Donald Trump enough that he doesn't turn his back on Europe, and in the hope of impressing Vladimir Putin enough that he doesn't turn his sights elsewhere on a NATO member state like Estonia that now worries that the alliance may not have its back.
And Katya, just on the increases in defence spending, what's been the most significant thing? Estonia is increasing its defence spending. Even a country like Spain, which spends less than other countries, is under pressure. But is it Germany? Is that the big deal? The change in Germany, the big increase in defence and infrastructure spending there?
I mean, yes, and yes. So I think it's all a big deal. And I think that, as journalists, we can get our eyebrows can be raised that we might be tempted to use hyperbole, and politicians as well. Of course, we're hearing a lot about watershed moments and historic turning points and all the rest of it. But, I've been watching European politics for many, 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 many years. This is huge when this continent can no longer just rely on the United States for its security and defence. That is huge. What is also huge is, and, there is a certain sympathy in many quarters in Europe for the argument from the United States. And Donald Trump is not by any means the first US president to say this, which is to Europe, guys, this is not fair. The US spends 3.7% of GDP, which for a country that size, that's a lot of money, on defence, but it means it doesn't have extra cash for other things. So, for example, the United States no way has a welfare state, the kind that's boasted in most European countries. But if Europe now digs deep into its pockets and makes defence spending a top priority, the money is going to have to come from somewhere. So either its government's taking out big loans and those loans have to be serviced, and that in the end is going to come out of taxpayers' money. I mean, the UK initially is cutting the aid budget, the overseas aid budget. But, that's not going to be enough. So social spending or more loans, I mean, that it's going to hurt. So I think when you're in Estonia, when you're in those countries that are so close to Russia, that have had such a damaging history with Russia, if you like. Don't forget the Baltics were subsumed. I mean, they were occupied, they say, by the Soviet Union for 40 years before its collapse at the end of the Cold War. That you don't need to explain to voters there why you want to spend a lot in defence. I mean, they're going up to 5% in Estonia, but they were already spending way more than 3%. We're, in the UK, we're spending 2.3%. We want to go up to 2.6% by 2027. The further you get away from Russia, the further you get away from that sense of threat, the harder it is to explain to voters why they may have to do without in other areas in order to have stronger defences. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned Spain. The worst culprits there, the biggest laggards, are in the Mediterranean, including 2 founding NATO members, Italy and Portugal. They are sort of really struggling. And Donald Trump has said, if you don't pay your way, I am not going to look after you. So I wonder whether these recent announcements by Estonia and neighbouring Baltic state Lithuania, which says it wants to spend between 5% and 6% by 2026, whether, that is trying to meet the Trump goal of 5% of GDP, even though that's not what they spend. But yeah, Germany traditionally, fiscally, so conservative. And now, boom, the parliament has just passed something which means that you can spend unlimited amounts in Germany, unlimited amounts on defence. So, of course, that's huge.
Yeah. And Jeremy, Katya talks there about Trump goals. I mean, you seem to get a different Trump goal every day, whether it's building hotels in the Gaza Strip, which, as you say, offended a lot of people, whether it's mining minerals in Ukraine, which actually offended some people in Ukraine as well. And now the talk of running nuclear power plants in Ukraine. It, as ever, with the President of the United States, is hard to keep up.
Yeah, and Zelensky actually has subsequently clarified and said the Americans are welcome to invest if they want to. And they were apparently talking about the Zaporizhia plant, which is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, which is actually at the moment in territory controlled by the Russians. It's not producing electricity. The Ukrainians get, I think, before the war, they were getting something like 60% of their electricity from nuclear power. They know a lot about nuclear engineering. So I think he believes that they're quite capable of running their own affairs. Thank you very much. But if the Americans would care to put some money in and modernize them, well, that would be great too. So he is not bending to that one at this point. No, I think what you can see in all of that is that when Trump deals with the Ukrainians, there's something in his head that clicks and clicks, and he thinks, well, what can we get out of this? We don't want to give them money and get nothing back. We don't want to be suckers. And this idea that allies are ripping him off is something that goes back decades with Trump. There's some video going around that was on social media that was from Trump on Oprah in the States, talk show in the 80s, in 88. And he was saying exactly what he says now. Saying they rip us off. They're treating us like suckers. We're not going to be that kind of person. So he's saying all that to Ukraine. It is interesting. He doesn't say that to Russia. Doesn't appear to anyway. We don't know what he said in those long private conversations. But he is much more conciliatory, and I think his eyes are shining at the prospect of even bigger deals in Russia if they can normalize relations. And I think the evidence now is overwhelming that Trump's actual objective is the normalization of those relations with Russia, and Ukrainian security, and indeed wider European security, comes a distant second. Don't forget there's a big, beautiful ocean, as he puts it, in between Europe and the United States.
I mean, this is all very obviously, by definition, deadly serious. But Katya, I do want to ask you a slightly lighter question. And we talked about your flight, and I would love to hear how it went and what it was like. Is that something you enjoy as someone who has to do it for their job, flying above the sky in a NATO plane, or was it something horrendous?
No, I like it because I like talking to people who are passionate about whatever their pet subject is, I think. So the whole beauty about being a journalist is that you get thrown in all these different situations on the ground, in the air, or wherever it is, and you meet people who feel very strongly about something. So when you're up in the air and something like that, there were 10 different NATO nations all working together. It's kind of a weird plane. It's like a passenger plane, except it isn't. So it sort of looks like a normal passenger plane from outside, but it's actually a NATO-owned aircraft, which there are not that many of those. And on the top of it, though, it had this huge metallic mushroom thing, which was basically the radar. And then when you get, this is all technical, vocabulary I'm using here with you, of course. And then when you get into the aircraft, when you walk down, instead of having rows of seats either side, you have desks. You have desks with computers, and you can just see the radar. So basically what these planes do, they go down all of what NATO calls its eastern flank. So some of them, from Romania, they'll also be monitoring Ukraine. This one was over the Baltic states. And they basically take a snapshot from the sky here at mainly ships and also aircraft, and they're looking for any suspicious activity. For me, the most sort of exciting bit was during the night. We were on there for many, many hours. During the night, I went and sat in the cockpit, and as well as sort of doing all the surveillance, they were also doing some pilot training exercises. It's a bit nerve-wracking because they were trying to do this, what I was talking about, air-to-air refueling, which is not a know-how that we have so much in Europe. It's more an American speciality that they've invested in. But anyway, there was actually an American aircraft, so that was above us. And so our job, well, the pilot's job, was to get directly underneath this other aircraft going at 1,000 kilometres, now both aircraft going at 1,000 kilometres an hour. And so these pilots were having to make corrections where they would make a movement, but the plane would actually move about 6 seconds later. I couldn't work it out. But anyway, put it this way, while I was sitting there, one of the pilots was excellent and one of them was really not good, so that the trainer had to grab the, whatever you call it, the controls.
That doesn't sound stressful at all.
Yeah, so that was kind of interesting. But when it was working, you could sort of see this skylight in the cockpit, and it did look like Starship Enterprise above us. And then, you sort of get a bit of refueling. But that was interesting. I quite like hanging out at the end of planes. I've done that in NATO flights. That was more adrenaline-y. This one was less adrenaline-y, except for the grabbing of the controls bit. But yeah, they're always interesting and an adventure. And you just talk to people on board and just say, why do you do what you do? Why is it important? What's it mean to you? And you kind of come off feeling like you've learnt a whole load of stuff. Yeah.
Well, it sounds interesting. Jeremy has been smiling the smile of a man who's hung out of a fair share of aeroplanes as well, I have to say.
Yeah, foreign correspondents normally have a few aviation stories. If the conversation turns onto that, it can go on for a while.
I'm sure, but I'm going to stop you. Jeremy, it's really nice to have you on Newscast as always. Thanks very much.
It's a pleasure always.
Thanks very much, Katya. Lovely to talk to you.
Great to talk to you. Bye-bye, both of you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.